Once a country torn apart by a superior minority. A minority who ruled without care or sympathy for the people of their own. A country once so soon through by racism and segregation that two fellow men couldn't ride the same bus. A country where law prevented love. A country saved by a former terrorist. A country united by a man who once tried to blow it up. A man who is remembered for his forgiveness and extreme love towards his country. A country where individuals completely change the way to think for a whole nation.
Audio Jungle.
20 years ago, the internet has just been invented, and the world is on the edge of a new era.
Audio Jungle.
Meanwhile, in South Africa, millions of Africans are still fighting against apartheid and racism. And today, 20 years after Nelson Mandela established democracy in South Africa, they are the biggest economy in the second largest continent in the world. But what has happened?
Audio Jungle.
This country's GDP, or gross domestic product, has tripled since the apartheid, and South Africa is one of the few countries to have sent a satellite into space. There are 11 million South Africans who have graduated from the low income to the middle or high income band, and the black part of the country's middle class has more than doubled. So clearly, this economy and its social rights and condition has risen. But still, an extreme rate of unemployment and social economic differences is still haunting this country.
Audio Jungle.
The overall rate of unemployment is actually higher than it was at the end of apartheid, and 14 million out of 23 million have a job,
Audio
or a
Jungle.
percentage of about 30% of the people deemed able to work are not doing it.
Audio Jungle.
This is a problem that South Africa have been fighting with for a very long time, yet they still can't solve it. Although 5 million jobs have been added over the past decades, the rate of unemployment is still higher than it was in the end of apartheid.
Audio Jungle.
In order to understand this, we need to take a look at the change in the available jobs. Once, South Africa's industry consisted of the agriculture, fishing and textile industry. But most of these things have been industrialized or replaced by cheaper labor. The jobs in South Africa today require more from the employees, and the education system needs improvement in order to achieve the demand skills. The only way to solve this is by improving the educational system. And the South African president says most of the black people who grew up under apartheid are not unemployed, but simply unemployable because of things like illiteracy and lack of skills.
Audio Jungle.
The biggest problem is that the labor force is simply inadequate. It's not satisfying the demands of the growing requirements on the labor market. So the South African companies they can't use the labor force from their own country, and sometimes they need to import it from other countries or move away from South Africa, which is a big problem in the country. The high rate of unemployment is resulting in a high rate of crime, and this is also one of the problems that South Africa faces today. But after all this, we need to remember that 20 years ago, vast amounts of people didn't even have access to water or electricity, and they were locked out of their own country. So while South Africa is a country that is facing problems, it is also a country that has changed completely to the good side.
Bartolomeu Dias was the first European to explore this region in 1488. Although the Portuguese basked in nautical achievement of successfully navigating the Cape, they showed little interest in colonization. The area's fierce weather and rocky shoreline posed a threat to their ships, and many of their attempts to trade with the local Khoikhoi ended in conflict. The Portuguese found the Mozambican coast more attractive, with appealing bays to use as way station for prawning as links to gold ores in the interior. Later, the Dutch and English colonized the part that we now call South Africa. The main use was to make bays where trading ships could rest and refill their resources on their way to Asia. Later, the population in these areas grew, and there started to be a lot of conflict between the Dutch and the English. When the English invaded Cape Town, a lot of Boers didn't like the way they ruled, and that led to what is now called the Great Trek, where thousands of Boers left Cape Town to colonize their own parts of the land. They ended up getting in a lot of wars with the natives of the North and South Africa and killed thousands and took just as many as slaves. History. The history of South Africa has been dominated by bad communication and conflicts between several ethnic groups, and there's very little left of the original population. The white South Africans are descendants of later European settlers, mainly from the Netherlands and Britain. The coloureds are descended from the slaves from Madagascar, East Africa and East Indies. There are many South Africans of Indian and Chinese origin that are descendants of labourers who arrived in the 19th and early 20th century. The Apartheid. Apartheid was a system of racial segregation in South Africa enforced through legalization by the National Party. The system that made it very difficult to be black, and the whole country was segregated into whites and blacks. The blacks got their own buses, toilets, and a lot of blacks were forced out of the cities by whites into towns for blacks only, so-called townships. In these townships, people lived in small squared houses called matchboxes, where there could live a whole family with grandparents and cousins in a matchbox. Because of the bad conditions, people were desperate, and it forced a lot of people into more shady ways of getting money, and that made the crime rate rise remarkably. Squatter camps. Because of the need of jobs, a great amount of people move to the cities in search of employment each year. But there aren't enough jobs, so when people don't get any money, they can't afford to live in their houses. So instead, they build these small shelters made from scraps and trash. Today, thousands of people live in squatter camps in and around the cities. Many of the people who live there has under $1 each day to live for. These areas are also badly hit by diseases such as HIV, yellow fever, and now Ebola as well.
Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, and grew up in the Middelburg. Rolihlahla was Mandela's birth name and it means troublemaker. The name Nelson was given to him on his first day of Christian school by his teacher. It was very common to give African children English names. In 1944, Mandela joined African National Congress. In the South African election in 1948, only white people were permitted to vote. The party who won were openly racist and expanded the racial segregation. Mandela had gained more influence in ANC and they started doing things against apartheid such as boycotts and strikes. They also did demonstrations, but the government responded with mass arrests. Mandela was arrested a couple of times and was imprisoned for several months. On August 5, 1962, he was arrested near Howick in the east of South Africa. Many larger groups have been accused of having tipped off the police about Mandela's location. He was sentenced with 28 years in total, but it was spread out on different convictions. He did 18 years in prison on Robben Island. He had a 8 by 7 feet cell made out of concrete. He had a straw mat, a little table and a bucket. The ANC selected him as their leader and he represented the political prisoners. They took part in hunger strikes to improve the conditions. 3 years later, the situation was improved. The blacks were given pants instead of shorts only. Games were allowed and the standard of their food was improved. When Nelson Mandela left Victor Verster prison on February 11th, he drove to Cape Town City Hall giving a speech about his commitment to peace and hopes for the country. On April 27, 1994, ANC won the election with 62% of the votes. They chose Nelson Mandela as South Africa's first black president. It was a radical change from apartheid to a multicolored democracy. Mandela didn't want to get back at the whites for apartheid. He wanted to forget and move on to a greater time. He didn't express his anger with violence or resistance of the whites. He kept very calm and handled it with tolerance. Mandela worked so hard to reassure that the white population was protected and represented in the Rainbow Nation, a nation gathered as one and not separated. He personally met with former leaders of the apartheid regime, making reconciliation and forgiveness the key words in his time as president. He encouraged black South Africans to get behind the previously hated rugby team, the Springboks, as South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup. They ended up winning against New Zealand in the finals, and Mandela showed his support by wearing a Springbok shirt with the captain's number. Mandela's efforts at reconciliation assuaged the fear of whites but also drew criticism from more militant blacks. Of a population of 40 million, around 23 million lacked electricity, 2 million children were not in school, and a third of the population illiterate. Under Mandela's presidency, the health welfare increased by over 13% a year. In 1994, free health care was introduced for children under 6 and pregnant women. By the election in 1999, ANC and Mandela could proudly announce that 1.5 million children were brought into the education system and 500 clinics were operated or constructed. When Mandela stepped down as president after one term, he also withdrew from politics. He wasn't the ANC leader anymore. The spot was now delegated to Thabo Mbeki, who was also the new president of South Africa. Even though he retired from politics, he still did a lot for his country. He worked with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, focusing on school constructions and conquering HIV and AIDS. After suffering from a respiratory infection, Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. He died at his home in Johannesburg, surrounded by his family. His death was announced on television by President Jacob Zuma.